Welcome to Bread and Roses. Hi everyone, I'm Maryam Namazie.
And I'm Fariborz Pooya, and we have a special program focusing on the events in Iran.
Of course, the protests in Iran are magnificent. They are very, very exciting times now to watch what's unfolding in Iran and its implications, not just for people in Iran, but for people throughout the world.
Yeah, and it's also shaken not only the Iranian institution, the government and the regime, but also the perception of change in Iranian society.
Now, of course, they started as anti-poverty, anti-corruption, anti-unemployment protests, and they have now culminated into protests against the entirety of an Islamic regime, against clerical rule and for freedom. And of course, let's talk a bit about some of the aspects of this protest. One of them, of course, is the issue of poverty. Poverty is so widespread in Iran. The government says 1/3 of people live under the poverty line. In fact, it's 2/3 of the population practically live under the poverty line. Unemployment, especially amongst youth, is up to 40%. So it is abject poverty, and of course this is something that's been reaching ahead now. There have been lots of protests against unpaid wages, for example, workers not being paid for 7-8 months, and now can you imagine a situation like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at the extent and depth of poverty in Iran, not only those people who do not have any work and are totally marginalized in society, but also people who are employed, the condition of work is such that it's just unimaginable in any part of the world these days. And this is taking place under 40 years of the Islamic Republic of Iran's rule. And that's important to recognize, the depth of poverty, and which is combined with rightlessness, that people do not have basic rights. And you know, when you combine that and you'll see people talk about the experience of what's happening to them, is staggering.
Yeah, and of course, you know, you've got situations where workers are not paid for 7-8 months, and then when they do go out to protest, they are flogged whilst the regime takes the side of the employers. Let's now watch a video from HEPCO workers talking about the fact that they haven't had wages for so long and how the regime is brutalizing them whilst they fight for their basic rights.
فقط اشتراک ریز نمیگیره پولی که خود و رفت آقای عطاریان سعیدی کجاه چرا اونه نمیتونی بگیری یه پرنا نتونستید بیاری اما حاضر شدید 1000 خورده نفر باتون کاری کنید نتیجه اخلاقی آقا باور کن پلیس هم با دوست صنعته اینو چرا دارید آئین میکنی دیگه آقا دست به جایی نمیرسه دزدا خیالشون راحت اونایی که دارن کارخانجات رو میزنن زمین خیالشون راحت این پلیس این استاندار با اونای آقا خیالتون تخت هر کاری دوست داری انجام بده هیچ کچت نباشه آقا جون هیچ کاری ما نمیتونیم بکنیم تا این اوضاعونه ما الان چند کیلومتر راه رفتیم چقدر آمدیم تو خیابون رفتیم تمام دنیا حب کنه به اسم میبرن بعد تو خونه خودمون آقا فکر خودمون نیستن بعد اخبار باز میکنیم میانمار لبنان غزه من نون ندارم بخورم من خرچی زنم از چه میتونم بدم این چه دینیه این چه مسلمانیه حالا شروع شد امام حسین 2400 سال پیش بود حالا تبل ساعت 12 شب میزنی تو سر زن بچه گشته من تبلش چیه؟ سم تبل میگیره با بانه تبل میبره.
And in this video you actually see how the religious institution, religious narrative is a tool of the government and the ruling class and capitalist class in Iran to deny the workers' right. And people could see they can't even feed their children. These are industrial workers who've been working for many years, and these are skilled workers. they can't feed the children. And you could think about the depth of rightlessness and poverty that exists within the rest of the Iranian population.
Yeah, and also one of the things is that when workers do protest, first of all, workers are not don't have a right to independent organization. They have to be government organizations. Of course, they've created their own independent ones, but they're considered illegal and they're often suppressed. Now imagine you go for a strike, for example, because of unpaid wages. The government says striking is haram. It's religiously unprohibited. You can be flogged. You can be given long-term prison sentences and even killed for being a labor activist, for merely organizing, for example, May Day protests. And of course, we know the situation of labor activists is atrocious. I mean, they're constantly brutalized, tortured, killed. Someone like Shahrukh Zamani.
And you could see, the depth of anger and frustration of the people against the Islamic regime of Iran. Its corruption and it's the whole system is rotten to the core.
I mean, one of the things in the protests that we're seeing, there are a lot of slogans against corruption as well, saying that the regime's officials are getting richer while people are getting poorer. And of course, there's this whole issue of the Malbakhtagan, isn't there? Which translates into people who've lost everything.
These are actually people who've retirees or pensioners who've had some pension fund to put it into a bank or a deposit account. Suddenly the bank is closed and all the funds has been taken away. And when you go to the Central Bank of Iran and you try to, claim your money back or protest, they say it's nothing to do with us. It's your private affair, and we can't interfere in the whole situation. And that's where we are unfortunately, in terms of corruption in Iran is endemic and is completely linked with the government officials, linked with the military Sepah and revolutionary guards, and within sort of years you see a small group of people are the wealth is unimaginable, but the mass majority of people, from pensioners, teachers, nurses, workers, normal sort of population, suddenly lose everything, and the price rises is just unimaginable.
And in addition to these issues, of course, there is this complete disregard for human welfare in all aspects of people's lives. The latest earthquake in Kermanshah was a perfect example where the public had to go and help. The government did absolutely nothing. And that also added to all this rage and frustration.
Yes, and the actually earthquake exposed the whole building industry, which was undertaken by the Revolutionary Guards, because all the investments are the Revolutionary Guards companies who've been building cheap housing without any regard for basic standards. They built really from cheap material, and everybody knows that if you build in this area with those conditions and those standards, the result is mass killing, and that's what's happened in Iran. While this is happening and people are suffering from, suddenly they face earthquake, they lose all the livelihood, they go on the streets. There's nobody there for weeks and weeks to support them. There's no infrastructure of, emergency services coming and pulling people out from underneath the rubble. Or when civil society and population, everybody goes to support them, all the material and people have actually gifts that people have given is stolen.
Yeah.
It's just an amazing sort of situation.
Let's watch a video now of the earthquake, of a woman who's been in the earthquake area, and hear what she has to say about it.
چند میلیارد کمک به ایران کرد حتما دادیم حتما چند میلیارد تومان اومد کجاست هیچی نمیخواد خود داره برای خدا هر چیز برای پلیس داره با خدا برش میگردونه همشون میفروشن خودشان مسئول هستیا مسئول هستیا همشون خودشون میفروشن به خدا کل فارسی بلد نیستم دیوانه شدم نگاه زندگی مبتم نگاه بچه‌ها مبتم چرا به داد ما نمیرسید چرا به داد ما نمیرسید دارم تعدیل بنا به ما خودش تانیه تاریخ خودی که بنا بابش خریده بابش این زندگی برای خدا خدا دیوانه شدم به خدا دیوانه شدم خدا دیگه نمیرم چیکار کنم.
And of course, another factor here is that Iran has a very young population. 70% are under the age of 30, and students and young people are protesting continuously, and of course are faced with lots of repression as well. Any type of protest is met with severe repression. Here's a video that we're going to show you from one of the student protests against gender segregation at the universities.
And you can see from this video, the young people are against segregation. They are demanding equal rights for men and women, and the situation of women that actually Islamists have imposed in on Iranian society is, you know, unimaginable. But of course there is the fights against this within, from women's movement, from everybody. Everybody wants equality between men and women, and they recognize the oppression of women is part and parcel of the superstructure and narrative to maintain a small group of people in power who are rotten to the core. And that's, you know, when you are talking about women's right in Iran, you're talking about the Islamic regime of Iran, you're talking about oppression, you're talking about, you know, a small group of people who have taken all the resources of the society and you know, for themselves, and left the rest of the society in poverty.
Yeah, and it's also of course about religious laws. I mean, theocracies are, you know, are inhuman to begin with. Particularly they always target women. So if you look at Sharia laws in Iran, for example, from a woman's testimony being half that of a man's, to the fact that women have limited rights to child custody and divorce, and of course this imposed compulsory veiling and gender segregation, women are the first victims and they're the first line of attack, but they're also on the front lines of resistance. And of course many of the iconic photos from these recent protests are of women. You know, the woman waving her scarf as a flag, and also another woman standing in front of the security forces and saying death to Khamenei. Let's see that video.
this situation has actually forced the whole of population. They're so frustrated, they're so angry, they have nothing to lose. That's why they're so confident about what they want, because they are very clear they don't want the Islamic regime of Iran. And the whole reformist supposedly camp was destroyed within 24 hours because they all went and backed the repression of the population and blamed foreign powers. We'll come to that in a minute. But this confidence within the Iranian society has been the hallmark of the recent protests that we've seen. Nearly 20 people have now lost their lives, but we've seen mass demonstration in so many cities in Iran.
It's been 63 cities, including, the Vatican of Iran, the holy city of Rome. Religious seminaries have been burnt down.
Yes.
If you look at the slogans that people are calling for, it's for bread, for freedom, but also targeting the entirety of the Islamic regime. So slogans against clerical rule, for example, they say clerics, shame on you, let go of the country. And also targeting Islam, saying Islam's been used as a stepping stone, but people are fed up with it. So it's very much really a secular slogans, secular demands, and for very universal ones. So in addition to the so-called reformist faction being dead, cultural relativism is completely dead as well, because it shows how very much these are very universal demands.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting things that actually happened in the last week, people have consciously and very cleverly targeted the religious institution, because of the fact this is part and parcel of demand for separation of religion from the state and people's affair, and that's the essence of the secularism. And we've seen we do not want religious government. Islamic regime must go, and they've actually targeted the head of the Islamic regime of Iran, which is Khamenei. It's always taboo, and everybody said, don't talk about everything, protest anything, do not mention his name, because he is the supreme spiritual leader. But people have now very clearly, all demonstrations are deaf to dictator, deaf to Khamenei, and we don't want this.
And also, of course, targeting the reformists, which is very important, isn't it?
And in response to this, the Islamic government was in a state of shock for a few days. But now they're very clearly, all factions come together, and they are blaming a small number of demonstrators and blaming the foreign powers and foreign agents. Foreign agents being into so many cities in Iran, the our organization supposedly. No, these are the poor people of Iran,
the poor, the hungry, the disenfranchised.
Absolutely. And these are the men and women who for 40 years suffered under the Islamic regime of Iran. There's no foreign power intervention here. This is a clear demand of people of Iran against the totality of the Islamic regime. And in the last few days, Islamic regime tried to organize counter demonstrations. We've seen photo of one in city of Karaj. It's about 30 people getting together and actually duplicating photos of from different previous demonstrations and pretending that these are the supporters of Islamic regime of Iran. But we've seen so many demonstrations which drowns completely the Islamic regime, and our oppressive forces are incapable of controlling people these days.
And of course, the so-called reformist Rouhani, he has said that people should be non-violent and come out and protest. First of all, people don't have the right to protest. The videos show very clearly that they're killing people, they're shooting at protesters, they imprison hundreds, and they have done over decades. And of course, non-violent, there's only one side that's violent, and it is the Islamic regime of Iran. And that's what really angers me about comments made by some governments as well, like Boris Johnson of the British government. He said that both sides should be careful, both sides. It's like telling the Nazis and Jews both sides need to be careful during the Holocaust. There is no both sides. One is the oppressor and the other is the oppressed. And of course, clearly, the Iranian regime must be condemned. The violations must be condemned. But we're not really hearing that all-out condemnation from governments.
And when you see all the major European governments are very diplomatic, they wouldn't say anything to upset the Islamic regime of Iran. They may just say, look, you got to be careful, you got to respect people's rights, but they're not upsetting the Islamic regime of Iran. And you could see that in the coverage of news by BBC. Everybody calls them Ayatollah BBC, which is the most right-wing intervention in Iranian politics, always been. Or CNN, they try to be trying to show all sides of the situation, and the only thing they inject into the discussion, either the monarchists or the religious sects, right, like Mujahideen Khalq, and actually represent the anger of the people. They try to undermine the protest that exists in Iran by saying it's not widespread, it's going to finish, and actually reflect
and also to manufacture leadership.
Yes, that's what they do. Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, Donald Trump has been tweeting how he supports the people of Iran. Yesterday, he said that Iranians were barred from entering the US, people who were fleeing for their lives, people who needed to get away from the Islamic regime, who are voting for with their very feet, people who are now dying on the streets of Iran and protesting. Now he supports them. I'm not quite sure how that works. But I think one of the things that's very clear for people in Iran is that the US has always been such a negative force in Iranian politics, but also in the Middle East and elsewhere. We don't want any US support or intervention militarily, economically, and so on and so forth. What we do need is people in America, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, everywhere, showing real solidarity with the protest movement there, people to people.
And that's the important thing, because that's the force actually that brings change everywhere. We've seen during the Vietnam War that the anti-war movement in United States, glorious. You'll have that anti-apartheid movement in Europe and in America, everywhere against apartheid in South Africa. And these are the forces that we need to organize, and actually that's what we want. We don't want people to say, be careful, very cautiously supporting the Iranian people and always refer to imperialism. No, let's be very clear that to bring any change, meaningful change in Middle East, in Iran, we have to get rid of the Islamic regime of Iran, and everybody's got to support people of Iran in the rightful struggle for decent society, for secularism, for women's right, to have a dignity and freedom to live in peace and prosperity.
And of course, you can be anti-militarism, US militarism, and also anti the Islamic regime of Iran. This is not a contradiction. People are concerned that if they support the Iranian protests, they'll be feeding into Donald Trump. It's not the case. You can be critical of Donald Trump, oppose his policies, and also oppose the Islamic regime of Iran. And that is a necessity in this day and age. Look, the Iranian revolution in 1979 was suppressed by an Islamic movement, and we've seen what's happened in these past 40 years with the rise of that Islamist movement. Today, another revolution is unfolding in Iran that could bring a different breeze of hope and a great challenge to the Islamic movement. It can bring an end to the sort of terrorism that we're seeing every day by people in Iran. It's such a hopeful movement. It's such an important movement, but there are no guarantees. It needs support if it is going to be able to get rid of the Islamic regime of Iran and bring a new dawn in Iran, but also for the world, really.
Absolutely. And this is a unwritten book. You can't leave it to Trump and the European governments, because they'll compromise. They use the situation in Iran as a means of negotiations and keep the status quo as far as possible. If you're really interested in changing Middle East, in people's life in Middle East, in Iran, directly support people of Iran today, and don't leave it to the governments, to BBC and CNN to shape and manufacture opposition and the next generation of oppressive governments. It's important that we act today in support of people of Iran independently, anywhere you are, organize and create an anti-Islamist supporters of Iranian people in your cities, in your institution, your college, and trade unions. Where are the trade unions supporting the workers in Iran? Where are the voices? They need to organize in support of people of Iran, because this is an important moment in the history of Middle East, and we shouldn't lose the opportunity.
Yeah, it could be a really, really beginning of something really great, but it does depend on us all.